On March 18, 2019, the Battle of Baghuz Fawqani commenced. This offensive, led by the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and supported by coalition airstrikes, artillery, and special forces from the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, CJTF-OIR, was part of the Deir ez-Zor campaign during the Syrian Civil War. The battle consisted of a series of ground assaults and marked the Islamic State's, IS, final territorial stronghold in eastern Syria. The village of Baghuz Fawqani is located in eastern Syria near the Euphrates River. The village is situated in the Deir ez-Zor governorate, close to the Syrian-Iraqi border. This area was the last significant outpost of the Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria, and this is where the Battle of Baghuz Fawqani took place. Since September 2017, the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, had been working hard to take back land from the Islamic State, ISIS, in eastern Syria. They had help from American, British, and French forces who provided air support, artillery, and special forces guidance. By September 2018, the SDF began the final stage of their campaign, pushing to capture the last bit of ISIS territory along the Euphrates River near the Iraq-Syria border. By February 1, 2019, ISIS was cornered in just 4 square kilometers of land. They were trapped against the river, with the SDF advancing from the northwest, Syrian government forces blocking crossings, and Iraqi troops stopping anyone from crossing the border. The situation was complicated by a huge number of civilians fleeing the area, which forced the SDF to pause their advance for nearly 10 days. During this time, over 20,000 civilians escaped. The SDF also suspected that some foreign hostages, including missing British journalist John Cantley and kidnapped Italian priest Father Paolo Dal Oglio, might be held there. On February 9, 2019, French Defense Minister Florence Parly visited a joint French-US artillery base near Al-Qaim, Iraq, which was helping the SDF. She met with the French troops and urged them to stay focused, reminding them that France was determined to finish the fight against ISIS, which had carried out attacks in France in recent years. On the evening of February 9, 2019, the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, declared that they were starting the final decisive battle against the ISIS enclave. Around 15,000 SDF fighters, supported by coalition artillery, airstrikes, and special operations forces, moved in to take the area. Initially, it was estimated that 400 to 1,000 hardened ISIS fighters were left, though numbers varied. The battle began with heavy bombardment from SDF mortars and US bombers, including B-1B Lancers. The intense fighting continued into the night, with the SDF advancing under the light of flares and frequent air raids. By the end of the day, the SDF had reported the deaths of 37 ISIS members, the destruction of 19 enemy positions, and several other damages. Throughout the night, and into the morning of February 10th, the SDF made early gains, capturing 41 key points within 2 square kilometers of land. They managed to fend off an ISIS counterattack and secure a safe path for 200 civilians to escape. SDF spokesperson Mustafa Bali mentioned that ISIS had requested safe passage out of the area, but the SDF was determined to fight until the end. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump tweeted that the US would soon control all of ISIS's territory in Syria. By the morning of February 11th, 1,500 more civilians had fled the area in trucks, with hundreds more continuing to leave. Some ISIS fighters were even disguising themselves in women's clothing to escape detection. Despite poor weather conditions, which often helped ISIS by hiding their movements, coalition forces continued their airstrikes. U.S. Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan noted that the SDF was making significant progress. One notable strike involved bombing a mosque used by ISIS as a command center. This action followed reports that ISIS was using human shields to deter attacks and slow the SDF's progress. Syrian state media reported that around 70 people were killed or injured when an airstrike hit a sheltering settlement. Coalition spokesman responded, "We are aware of open-source reports of civilian casualties. We take all allegations of civilian casualties seriously and understand there is a lot of misinformation as well." The sounds of explosions and gunfire echoed for miles as intense coalition airstrikes and SDF missile attacks pounded the battlefield. Eyewitnesses described huge plumes of white and dark gray smoke rising into the sky as warplanes and missiles streaked overhead. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, SOHR, reported that the SDF's advance was slower than expected because ISIS was using tunnels, snipers, car bombs, anti-tank missiles, and landmines. The SDF had to carefully clear mines as they moved forward. General Joseph Votel from U.S. Central Command described the battle as taking place in a cramped, heavily fortified area filled with explosives and traps set by ISIS. Estimates of the remaining ISIS fighters varied. While the SDF and ez-Zor thought around 3,000 were left, earlier coalition estimates were lower. By February 10th, SDF spokesman Mustafa Bali said there were about 600 fighters still in Baghuz Fawqani. Reports suggested that negotiations were ongoing, but the SDF insisted on unconditional surrender. Meanwhile, Italian media reported that freelance photographer Gabriele Michalizzi was injured by a rocket-propelled grenade and airlifted to Baghdad. The observatory said 13 ISIS fighters and 6 SDF members were killed in recent fighting, and 16 civilians died in airstrikes by the end of February 11th. On February 12th, civilians continued to flee in dusty trucks to refugee camps in northeastern Syria. Some reported being shot at by ISIS while trying to escape, and others described dire conditions, including starvation. Fighting persisted throughout February 12th, with the coalition bombing entire neighborhoods as the SDF made progress. ISIS used trash and tire fires to create thick smoke, complicating airstrikes and making it hard for SDF troops to breathe. At the end of the day, the SDF reported that ISIS controlled only 1 square kilometer of territory, and all remaining people there were ISIS fighters and their families. SOFR mentioned that U.S. officials had demanded ISIS surrender 40 tons of stolen gold for safe passage. On February 13th, reports emerged that ISIS had executed more than 15 of its own fighters for attempting to surrender. The SDF captured the town center and forced many ISIS fighters to flee. They received 425 fleeing civilians within 24 hours, some of whom had gunshot wounds, likely from ISIS, shooting at their own families. The SDF and coalition used biometric tools to screen for jihadist ties. The International Rescue Committee reported that 51 people had died on the way to the Al-Hal refugee camp, mostly young children suffering from hypothermia. On February 14th, the situation outside town was quiet, with the SDF making slow progress and capturing valuable resources. By February 15th, rain, fleeing civilians, and ISIS ambushes continued to slow the SDF's advance. Engineering teams worked on clearing tunnels and mines, and a coalition convoy aimed to draw out the remaining fighters. By the end of the day, 200 ISIS fighters had surrendered. On February 16th, SDF commander Gia Furat spoke at the Al-Omar oil field staging area. He announced that ISIS's remaining territory had shrunk to just 700 square meters, and promised that victory would be declared within a few days. Furat also mentioned that ISIS had released 10 captured SDF members, but continued to demand a safe passage to Idlib. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, SOHR, noted that the SDF was close to full control, but some ISIS fighters were still hiding in tunnels with hostages. There were also 2 coalition airstrikes reported in the area. Civilian evacuations and small skirmishes continued through February 18th. By February 19th, ISIS's hold had reduced to a few small areas of a couple hundred square meters. The SDF issued a clear ultimatum: surrender or face battle. They continued to carefully manage the situation, with trucks constantly evacuating civilians. The United Nations raised concerns about around 200 families, including many women and children, trapped in the besieged area. By nightfall, 2 more coalition airstrikes hit the area, as many ISIS fighters refused to surrender. On February 20th, the SDF announced their plan to evacuate all civilians before launching a final assault on the remaining 120 300 IS fighters, who were believed to be hiding in the Hawi al-Dandal area, with at least 100 civilians. The next day, SOHR reported that about 260 mostly foreign ISIS fighters remained, preferring to fight to the end rather than surrender. The SDF had hoped to have the last civilians out by February 21st, but no one was seen leaving that day. Journalists spotted warplanes and U.S. attack helicopters scouting the area, though no combat was visible. French sources also reported that the coalition was checking if French jihadist Fabien Klein had been killed in an airstrike, with his brother Jean-Michel seriously wounded. The coalition confirmed Klein's death on February 28th. The SDF were surprised to find so many civilians still in the enclave. Many civilians continued to flee, some using tunnels and wrecked buildings. Human Rights Watch quoted escapees saying smugglers were charging $400 per person. An SDF commander estimated it might take another 4 to 5 days to get all the civilians out. Early on February 26th, another group of ISIS fighters and their families surrendered to the SDF. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, reported that 9,000 people had evacuated the enclave in the past 72 hours, with 99% being women and children. One of the SDF stated that, "We fought for every meter, every house. They were hiding among civilians, using women and children as shields." However, SOHR added that 1,400 people had left since February 24th, including some suspected ISIS militants. Recent coalition airstrikes focused on pushing back ISIS fighters who were blocking roads and escape routes, trying to prevent civilian hostages from fleeing in previous weeks. On February 27th, the coalition provided a summary of its recent air and artillery strikes in the area. Between the 10th of February to the 23rd of February, the coalition conducted 186 strikes consisting of 426 engagements, including damaging or destroying 285 ISIL tactical units, 189 fighting positions, 50 supply routes, 22 staging areas, 16 boats, 15 vehicles, 6 petroleum oil tankers, 6 aircraft operations areas, 6 VBIEDs, 4 command and control nodes, 3 weapons caches, 3 heavy machine guns, 3 pieces of engineering equipment, 2 buildings, 2 tunnels, 1 cave, 1 IED production facility, and 1 petroleum oil storage facility. The coalition defines a strike as one or more kinetic engagements that occur in roughly the same geographic location to produce a single, sometimes cumulative effect in that location. On February 28th, SDF spokesperson Adnan Afrin revealed that a mass grave had been discovered in a town 10 days earlier. The grave held numerous bodies, including severed heads. While the SDF tried to determine if the victims were Yazidis or IS members, spokesperson Lilwa Abdullah later confirmed they were Yazidi, though the exact number was unclear. Locals, however, claimed the bodies were from airstrikes. By March 1st, the Free Burma Rangers reported that 15,000 people had fled Baghuz in the past month. At a nearby screening center, an Egyptian woman shared that IS was preventing men under 40 from leaving, including her husband. Some evacuated IS brides continued to support the group and its leader, proclaiming their loyalty as they left. At 6 p.m. local time on March 1st, SDF spokesman Mustafa Bali announced that the standoff with IS was over. The SDF began attacking the remaining IS camps, which were built on a network of caves and tunnels. Bali noted that the SDF would proceed carefully to avoid traps and protect any civilians found. Heavy fighting continued, with IS using snipers, drones, and traps against the SDF. By March 2nd, the SDF had captured 6 key positions and a hill overlooking the main IS camp. Fighting was intense, with IS deploying vehicles filled with explosives and using various tactics to resist the SDF's advance. The SDF made further advances on March 3rd, capturing several points despite ongoing resistance from IS fighters. The group used the cover of a dust storm to launch counterattacks, with one successful attack resulting in casualties among SDF forces. By March 4th, the SDF slowed their advance to evacuate civilians being used as human shields by IS. Around 500 people, including suspected militants, surrendered. The exact number of IS fighters remaining was unclear due to extensive tunnel networks. On March 5th, the SDF reported that 3,000 people had fled through the newly opened corridor, bringing the total number of evacuees to 10,000 since February 10. Among those who surrendered was Dorot Maker, who confirmed that her late husband's brother and another prominent figure were killed in recent strikes. The standoff continued into March 10th. Despite the SDF's efforts to clear the camp, IS fighters and their families remained, delaying the final assault. SDF spokesperson Mustafa Bali announced that tens of thousands, including 4,000 IS fighters, had surrendered in the past month. By March 13th, IS mounted counterattacks using suicide bombers, resulting in casualties among SDF forces. On March 23rd, the SDF declared victory over IS in Baghuz Fawqani at a ceremony further up the Euphrates River. Senior U.S. diplomat William Roebuck described this as a critical milestone against the terror group, though he acknowledged that IS remained a global threat. The area was described as a wasteland, with debris and remnants of the battle still evident. The battle marked the end of IS's self-declared caliphate, though its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and some hostages were still unaccounted for. In November 2021, U.S. Central Command confirmed that a March 18, 2019 bombing in Baghuz had resulted in the deaths of dozens of civilians. This acknowledgement, made in response to an inquiry from the New York Times, revealed that the strike had killed 80 people, including at least 16 Islamic State fighters. So, this is it, my folks. I hope you enjoyed watching today's video. Let us know what your thoughts are about this insane story in the comments. If you love war stories like these, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave this video a like if you enjoyed it. Till then, take care of yourself. See you in our next video.